Let's bring you this discussion now. Back in 2005, William Nkuna was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his girlfriend, police officer Frances Rasuge. He was convicted without her body being found and sentenced to life in prison. Years later, the victim's remains were found in Temba outside Pretoria. Nkuna has now served enough of his sentence to be considered for parole. But let's bring in legal journalist Karen Maughan to unpack this story. It's got a long history, the failures of the parole system perhaps as well. And what does justice look like for the families here? Karen, it's great to talk to you as always. Thanks for coming on and thanks for your patience. No surprise here, just given the horror of Frances Rasuge's death and then the search for her remains, that her family says they will never forgive her killer.
I think there are a lot of issues with this particular case. Not least of all was the fact that William Nkuna never admitted what he had done. I mean, at one stage, Michelle, he even did an interview with Radio 702 at the time when she had disappeared, saying that, he missed her, but he didn't know, whether she would ever be found. I remember interviewing the prosecutor in that matter who described Nkuna as, quote unquote, a possessive psychopath. Who, when his former girlfriend at that stage, Rasuge, was actually dating someone else, tried to leave him, took her life in the most violent and horrendous manner possible. But to this day, we know there's been some form of victim-offender dialogue with her family, but we have no indication that he has actually ever admitted what he had done and taken responsibility for it in a meaningful way. And of course, getting back to the fact that it was only, 7 years after he was sentenced to life in prison that Frances Rasuge's body was found in the backyard of his RDP home. Her family had to deal with the understandable trauma of her remains not being found and the sort of anguish of her not being laid to rest at a place where they could visit her and be at peace with the fact that she was finally in a place where she would be at rest and her remains could be properly interred. So I think there are a lot of different reasons why that family would not be particularly amenable to the suggestion that he may now, all these years later, get his freedom.
And when we talk about the importance of victim impact statements, Karen, 7 years after her murder, that's when her body is found, as you say, buried outside his RDP home. Just to, and all of us can do this. We can put ourselves in the shoes of a family going through the worst time in their lives, the brutal murder of their loved one, and in this case, their breadwinner as well, and then spending the next 7 years without her remains.
And also, Michelle, you and I both know this, is when we work with people whose loved ones have been taken by violent crime, part of the trauma of that experience is not knowing what happened to them. What were their last moments? What were they going through? Were they suffering? And of course, because her body was not found and it was found at a very advanced stage, there was no real indication at that stage of what her last moments would have been, her cause of death, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we know that Nkuna has never given those details to the family. So, they are still, having had her remains returned to them, still in the absolute dark as to what her final moments were. And did she suffer? I mean, this was a beautiful 27-year-old woman who, as you rightly point out, was a breadwinner for her family, but had her life snatched away from her before she could, advance in her career, possibly get married, be a mother, simply because this man was unwilling to accept that she could exist without him. And what is tragic, of course, Michelle, is that anyone who covers intimate femicide cases knows that it is when women leave that they are the most vulnerable. And the typical explanation given by men like Nkuna, though he has never admitted this, is that they, have no right to exist without them outside of that relationship. Until William Nkuna takes proper accountability for that, and even if he does, I'm not sure anyone will accept that this is a person who presents the kind of human being that should be released back into society.
And of course, Frances Rasuge's father, Karen, died in 2010, before her remains were found.
It's one of those tragedies that you see replicated again, also in the matters where, apartheid era victims are not found and restored to their families. It is a form of torture because, according to many beliefs, when your remains are not buried with that of your family members, your soul is essentially adrift in the universe. And that's a particularly painful thing for many of our fellow South Africans. And I think that, him being laid to rest at a time where he didn't know where his daughter was, I mean, one cannot underestimate the level of pain on him, but also against that entire family.
And the grief that he must have been going through. So Karen, in terms of the parole board process, you've outlined to us that William Nkuna has never taken responsibility for the murder of Frances Rasuge, despite where her body was found. What does the parole board then take into consideration? Okay, fine, you are eligible now for parole, but what are their considerations in the granting of parole?
This is a very important situation because William Nkuna was sentenced to life in prison. So unlike in a normal parole process, his parole as a lifer would need to be approved by the minister and would need to, after a recommendation from the National Council on Correctional Services. So this is not a situation where a parole board is going to make the overriding decision. And we have seen with Pieter Groenewald in the past that he has been, pushing back hugely on this idea that lifers inevitably will get released after, serving a substantive amount of time. We know that he reversed the decision in terms of the horrific rape, for example, of Alison Botha. So, it is going to be quite a thing for the parole authorities to make a recommendation to him that Nkuna should be released. And it would obviously be within the minister's discretion to make that final call. Having gone through parole process in the past, Michelle, and having looked at those files, there are deep, psychological, social worker examinations that are done on inmates serving life to really ascertain, whether do they actually now at this point take responsibility for what they've done. We don't know what the impact of the victim-offender dialogue was. Judging by the response from Frances Rasuge's family, certainly it has not given them the closure that, maybe they would have hoped it would have given them. But there will also be a number of detailed reports as to his conduct in prison, which will inform whether those initial, processes to evaluate whether he is in fact a suitable candidate for parole have been, that there's checks into those boxes. But I think one of the biggest issues in South Africa is, again, you and I will know that the Medical Research Council investigation revealed that the leading cause of unnatural death for South African women is death at the hands of an intimate partner. And in that context, given the rates of GBV that we experience, and given his lack of honesty and his kind of psychological torture of that family, knowing full well that the entire time where there was all these police searches where they were doing everything they could to find Frances Rasuge, knowing full well that her bodies, her bones, her broken was in the backyard of his home and saying nothing, I think that would be a very deterrent factor in terms of the ultimate decision that gets made here.
So yeah, certainly, as you say, it is psychological torture, isn't it? And beyond the Rasuge family, which is, of course, the most important part of the story, Karen, Nkuna is somewhat of an infamous figure in Temba. What can you tell us about that?
You and I were both working at ENCA in 2012, where Frances Rasuge's body was eventually found. And I remember going to, it was called... It was the hairdresser's name was Desmond Konto, and it had been the last salon where Frances Rasuge had been seen before she was picked up by William Nkuna, never to be seen again. And there was this huge culture of fear around Frances Rasuge's disappearance, because 2 days after Francis Rasuge disappeared. And of course, after Des Mkhonto identified William Nkuna as being the person that had been the last person seen with her, he actually died under very mysterious circumstances that Des Mkhonto's family very much blamed William Nkuna for. And when I was there in that area, there was this palpable air of fear around this case. Even the prosecutor said to me that it had been this huge issue that had hung over this case when he was prosecuting it, that people were so terrified of William Nkuna and so terrified of what he could do to them if they spoke up. So it wasn't just, this base allegation and the evidence that he had, been an incredibly possessive and psychologically dangerous person to Francis Rasuge. It was that he held a kind of spell over this entire area, and people were so scared of him to the degree, Michelle, that when he was ultimately convicted, the entire area disrupted into huge celebrations because people were so relieved that he was finally behind bars. So that gives you a sort of indication over the kind of spell that he cast over this entire area, with tragic consequences, of course, for Francis Rasuge. And Des Mkhonto's family will say for Des Mkhonto.